let's start with COVID then. Um, Maybe let's start like where were you and how did you first hear about this this virus and how
So
that started?
I was just reading my daily content stream in January, and I I had heard about the virus in early January just from some of the biomedical stuff I had seen,
Yeah.
novel virus. But I took it seriously, like many people did, but not enough,
Hmm.
when China locked down Wuhan.
Mm.
Because that was an unfakeable signal. You look at actions rather than words,
Yes.
and that was not something that the Chinese government, which is very serious about economic development, would have done lightly. And then after that, recognizing it's a contagious kind of thing, and that it wasn't going to be a magical containment zone that would keep it in China in the age of international travel, and then reading all the early papers, I was like, this looks actually very serious. And it is not being covered enough. And it's being treated as if it's something that's like, something that happens to foreigners, haha.
Yeah.
And in fact, there were some remarks like this, in the administration. They were like, oh, well, this is going to hit the Chinese economy and it'll show that America's on top. And even,
Yeah.
much of the reporting from the NYT and others was basically their foreign reporters were covering it, but domestically they were poo-pooing it. The tech reporters thought it was, I mean, they literally tried to cover up the whole thing, which we can get um, to everybody's major detriment, right?
Hmm.
And then, we asked when and how did you realize it was more than just the flu? I mean, like as soon as I had heard about it, I thought it was serious. The
Yeah.
question was basically, was this going to be like Ebola, where it was so serious that it actually wasn't that contagious, because all the early cases were actually fairly serious, like, the Wuhan pneumonia. Um, the, Ebola, just for your audience to know or what have
Hmm.
you, like if something is really serious as a pathogen, as many people probably know by this point at least, um, then the carrier of it dies before they can pass it on, or they're incapacitated and they're just lying on a bed. And so it's actually not that contagious. So there's sort of a sweet spot of being contagious enough or virulent enough rather to generate lots of viral particles to make you go, bah, bah, like cough it up, mucus, whatever, everywhere. Uh, but not so much that it renders you completely non-ambulatory. So you kind of turns you into a super spreader before bursting the host alien style. Um, so it was pretty clear that it was serious. The question was how contagious it was, and that's when like kind of tracking the Johns Hopkins dashboard, which had some of the best stats early on, and really just refreshing that every 12 hours and
Hmm.
and triangulating off of the New England Journal of Medicine and whatnot. And I actually hesitated to tweet about it for a while
Mm.
simply because it was going to be seen as quote paranoid or whatever. And then I put up a marker on January 30th, once I saw these pieces that were like, don't worry about coronavirus, worry about the flu, infamous
Hmm.
BuzzFeed,
Hmm.
piece, which they just, by the way, stealth changed the headline. They never terminated anybody. Nobody resigned. Nobody even apologized. No retraction. They just stealth edited the headline like 6 weeks later to pretend that they hadn't all pumped this article, right? Where, normally when you trust this stuff, you just lose money. Here, you literally could have lost your life, it
Yeah.
actually gets very serious. It's not a joke,
Yeah.
and this is something we can come
Yeah.
back to. Um, so January 30th, I put up this thread, which I think has gone moderately viral. It was the one which was it was called "Going Viral." Have you seen that one?
Yes, I remember it, and I can.
Yeah. So it's like, what if this coronavirus is the pandemic that public health people have been warning about for years? And the reason I phrased it that way is that people were in such a poo-pooing mode
Yeah.
that I had to kind of remind them that, wait a second, like there's a lot of very legitimate, science and academic research and frankly historical records that show that pandemics do exist and things can
Yeah.
go viral. And so just being in this, oh, you're so paranoid or whatever mode was just very bizarre to me.
Yeah.
And so I said it would accelerate many pre-existing trends: border closures, nationalism, social isolation, preppers, remote work, face mask distrust in governments. And I
Yep.
kind of think
Yep.
that unfortunately all happened.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, and that's, you know, that I think I mean, that sort of brings me to, I think, what is sort of like the important question is like, how did, I guess, like, how did the, oh, I think it looks like I guess what I was going to get at was like, how did we went from don't wear masks. I remember the Surgeon General had a tweet
Right.
that said don't wear masks, right?
Yep. Yep.
And like, the healthcare workers need it, which there was two things. There was the healthcare workers need it, which actually I suppose is like makes some sense because they're the most exposed. But then there was also, but they don't work, or they won't help, right? And then very quickly, like it was like weeks when like it became mandatory. And
Well, so it's
right?
funny. I was in the middle of a lot of that, right?
Yeah,
And there's so much official misinformation flying around.
right.
Initially, just a few of them. The flu is more serious. Travel bans are overreacting. Only Wuhan visitors are at risk. Avoiding handshakes is paranoid. The virus is contained. Tests are available. Masks don't help.
Yeah,
Right? All of those were things that had been promulgated over the critical months of January and February, but had basically been retracted or at least contested by like March 23rd. And people were fighting masks for actually quite a while. And, the and then they just completely flipped as if they had never fought them. And then, oh my God, why aren't you wearing a mask?
right.
And what I've realized is that for lots of folks, they just want an authority to tell them what to do.
Yeah,
And they get extremely uncomfortable when they're asked to actually make their own decisions for anything genuinely important, or to evaluate the evidence. It just made me realize how few people want to or care to evaluate the evidence, which is a point we can come back to later, and how
yeah,
you actually have to solve this. And in a sense, evaluating evidence in a given area is of course, it's as much of a skill, but it's useful to articulate this. It's as much of a skill as being able to build a chair or engineer a printer or, like fix eyeglasses or something like that. You need to know carpentry or, like the physics of inkjets or optics. You have to have some domain knowledge. So being able to evaluate information in an area is not something you can just say, oh, everyone should do.
mhm,
Um, if this had been some nuclear disaster or something like that, I would have had to have learned more nuclear physics. I knew enough biology that I could diligence a lot of this stuff directly. What
mhm.
was interesting to me though is that folks who were journalists without any training in the area would speak about this stuff very authoritatively
Right.
to people who did have training in the area, which included lots of biotech VCs.
Yeah.
And it was just bizarre kind of episode. Go ahead.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's um, so. I mean, and you sort of hit on this sort of question of expertise, right? I mean, yes, like people should, you mentioned like being able to evaluate evidence, but not everyone's a doctor. Not even, I mean, not everyone. People probably should study the hard sciences more than they do in my profession, but not everyone's going to be an epidemiologist, and not everyone is going to be able to sort, the noise from the signal when it comes to these things that required an advanced degree. So, like where does this go? And I mean, this sort of question, like what is trusted, reliable expertise in the future, and how's that going to be different from what we know and yeah.
Excellent question. And this is a thing that I've thought about most deeply this year. And I think I've got an answer actually on
Yeah.
this. And I've poked at it and so on. Short answer is oracles and advocates.
Okay.
Okay. So oracles are basically like crypto oracles.
Hmm.
And, uh, you know, right now, if you think about various authorities on different things, the Weather Channel is like an authority on what the temperature was in Dallas on March 25th of this
Right.
year. Okay.
Right.
Um, you know, uh, let's say Twitter is the authority on what somebody tweeted at a given time. Zillow or Redfin is an authority on like real estate prices in a given area. Okay. And so on and so forth. You've got each of these kinds of entities that are generating feeds of data. And an important observation is that, when you talk about many articles today, they're basically just letters that are wrappers around the numbers. For example, sports articles are wrappers around box scores, and many financial articles are wrappers around ticker data.
Mm-hmm.
And many political articles these days are wrappers around tweets.
Yep.
Right. And like it's actually something which is pretty interesting, because it used to be very hard to go and get a famous person on the record. That used to be actually, access used to be really very, very, very scarce. And now everybody's on the record all the time. And so you've got all the 6 journalist things. You can get who, what, when, where, why, and how from Twitter, because who said what.
Yeah.
Twitter gives you the timestamp when. There's the GeoIP of where, right? Which can be spoofed or whatever, but at least, like it is usually not, I guess. Why and how come from context. How, in the most narrow senses, they post from iPhone or Android or something like that. People have even written stories on that stuff. And why comes from context, So you can now interview someone and get the basic facts, or at least assertions, in the absence of an actual interview. So the basic things have kind of been put up there. And one way of thinking about it is, it's not just the sports and the financial and the tweet feeds, but there's all these other feeds like the ones I mentioned. There's the weather feed, there's the feed of coronavirus stats, there's a feed of real estate price. And all of these feeds right now are siloed over thousands, really millions of databases. Every single time that you go out and you walk, your Fitbit is writing some data to one of these databases. You send an email, you're writing data to another database, et cetera. A long-term vision is that many, and eventually maybe, I shouldn't say all, but a lot of those databases, those feeds, go from online to on-chain. Because on-chain is the third level of deployment. Okay, so there's on-disk, online, on-chain. On-disk is for the files only you care about. Right. Online is for the files other people care about. And on-chain is for the files that people really care about, where they want guarantees of, let's say, immutability, or a edit log, or basically cryptographic receipts, or proof of X, proof of Y. That's the stuff where people aren't just going to trust you. They want like a higher level of guarantees. And there's actually more use case for that than people have realized. For example, every scientific paper, as I'll come to, it shouldn't just have the PDF on chain. It needs to have the code and the data on chain as well.
When you say on chain, do you mean the hash it? Because when I think of on chain, I think of on chain means on chain proves, it doesn't prove that something is true. It just proves that the data existed in a certain state at a certain time.
Yeah. So there's a 2000. There's the okay. So if you think about what was a web application in the year 2000 versus what is it in the year 2010 or 2020, right? In the year 2000, a lot of things were of the form, imagine a sufficiently advanced JavaScript compiler and sufficiently advanced broadband, right? And all kinds of things would be possible. And it was pretty hard, like Google Maps and Gmail were enormous technical innovations at the time. Ajax in 2004 and 2005. We sometimes forget how big a breakthrough it was to make that stuff run in the browser. It was like there weren't any frameworks for that. They figured it all out, whatever. Now, of course, writing web apps has become much easier, and you can download a meg of JavaScript on your phone, walking around, right?
Yep. So
today, what on-chain means is different from what it's going to mean in 2025 and 2030 and 2035 and 2040. And today, on-chain may mean something like what you just said, which is settling for having a hash, up there, right? And then that hash, maybe it's a URL, maybe it's a URL plus a hash or something like that. And then you go and you pull the data from IPFS or something. And that's fine, right? Just like the early, internet apps, Amazon and Google, for example, are actually intentionally bandwidth limited in how they were engineered, right? You just type in a search query and you get back 10 blue links, right? You click things on a website. Amazon wasn't doing streaming video in the 90s and early 2000s, to my knowledge at least, right?
Yeah.
Netflix wasn't either. They waited almost 10 years before they did streaming video, and it was gradual and then sudden. And so the early ones are going to be things where, yeah, it's going to be a hash, but eventually you want all the data on chain. And just to give one clarification, when I say on chain, it doesn't have to literally be a blockchain. Right. It just has to be something that gives appropriate guarantees. For example, there's gun.echo, which I'm an investor in. That's like a different kind of decentralized database. There's IPFS, of course. Mm-hmm. There's Arweave. I'm not an investor in that, but that's cool. And so on and so forth. Mirror is trying to do decentralized blogging. There's a bunch of these different approaches. And I think we're going to find that there's horses for courses. That is to say, different decentralized file systems will be optimized for different workloads. Just like you've got S3 and you've got Glacier and you've got RAM locally and whatnot. You'll pay much more for storage that needs to be randomly accessed by smart contracts or decentralized programs, and less for things that are archival and you don't need to access all that often. That's usually the case. Okay, so on chain just means decentralized with some cryptographic guarantees of some kind. Okay, so once you can do this, though, once you realize, all right, we've got many of these articles are wrappers around tweets or box scores or financial tickers of some kind, and in fact they're all feeds, and those feeds are going on chain. Okay, now you start realizing, okay, that's cool, because that's actually like Twitter in an interesting sense, where you disintermediate, right? Everybody has direct access to all the data that you need to put together an article. Mm-hmm. And we're close to that, but we're not yet fully there. It's like in the year 2000, there was sort of the theory that everything was going to be online. Mm-hmm. That was before Wikipedia and GitHub and Stack Overflow and Google Images and Google Maps and, all of these various kinds of search engines and whatnot. Now, if I just think of anything, if I think of purple traffic light and I Google that, I'm pretty sure I'm going to see a Google image of a purple traffic light or a bunch of them. Mm-hmm. It's actually kind of insane how many kinds of things like that people have actually taken images of. We just take it for granted, but it's this amazing thing that's happened, right? So while today it'll be sort of hackish, it's a little bit of use your imagination to get all of those feeds online or on chain. It's happening starting with price stuff, right? So Chainlink is actually, their market cap is high, but they're actually doing good stuff. I think they're executing fairly well. I'm not like, I may have some like small Chainlink holdings. I just want to give all my disclosures or whatever, just to be religious about that, right? But I have some small Chainlink holdings, but I've known Sergey Nazarov for a while. He's been a smart guy and is actually someone who's been interested in the space for a long time. And Chainlink is doing a lot of the right things, where they're decentralizing the uploads of data. They've got multiple providers of data sets. They can do cross-verification, lots of good stuff, right? So you start with the tickers where they're just directly useful, okay? And then eventually you extend to other kinds of tradable data. And here is a key insight, for me at least. These oracles, these crypto oracles, are individually subsidized frequently by prediction markets, right? But in a way that I don't think people realize. Everybody's talked about prediction markets focusing on their ability to predict the future. Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm agnostic on whether that'll actually happen. Mm-hmm. However, I think they're very valuable for verifying the past. So I'd call them verification markets as opposed to prediction markets. And here's why. If you've got a horse race, okay, people go and they love to bet on a horse race. It's not like a super high liquidity market. They just love to do it. Okay. Yeah. Just humans being humans. Okay. And, maybe there's somebody who's really good at predicting horses or whatever, but it's sort of meant to be kind of random. Yeah. You do get out of that is you get an extremely good record of which horse won the race. Yes. Okay. That's something where, because there's bets on it, there's actually an incentive to actually verify the data. Yes. Okay. Verify who won. So that's super interesting, where you start thinking of these as verification markets for the past as opposed to prediction markets of the future. You've got a way to subsidize digital history. Even if it's a zero-sum game that subsidizes that digital history, who cares? Because there's a positive sum externality for society, which is actually kind of good, right? And if you also get prediction signal out of it, wow, even better. Yeah. Okay. As I said, I'm agnostic on that. It'd be great if it happens, but it doesn't even have to happen. Horse racing is illegal. It exists. Let people knock themselves out. In general, by the way, you might call it narrowly zero sum, that there's a winner or a loser in the game, but it's, I think, also positive sum in a different respect. If you've seen, there's a study from a while back, betting reduces partisanship. Have you seen that? Yeah.
No, but it sounds familiar. It sounds like something
Sounds familiar.
we'll talk about.
Marginal Revolution blogged about it several years
Yeah.
ago,
Okay.
but essentially the idea is what it sounds like. When there's money on the line, even a relatively small amount of money, people kind of come down from their partisan echo chamber type things and give like the factual answer. For example, you ask a very partisan Republican, hey, were WMDs found in Iraq? Okay. And they're going to give you the partisan answer. At least they were several years ago. Nowadays, maybe they won't care. But like several years ago, that was Republican PC. And so, but then when you said, here's $10 if you can get at least the consensus answer, you might argue as to what is true. We can come back to that point. There's a huge shift because now there's actually incentive to, quote, defect from the tribe towards the truth, right? Truth over tribe. Okay. And so betting, I think it's not the only thing that does it, but I think it is something that can reduce partisanship. So even if that zero sum kind of thing is there in a local sense, in a global sense, you've gone and you've started to resolve, the screaming matches they're too common on social media with an actual bet where both sides kind of agree that the market is an arbiter of what's true. And what's funny is whenever you do that, you find that people converge so much more than you might think they do, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's people who are like, X should be done, Y should be done. And when you ask exactly where it is, they're like, okay, I'm at like 0.45 and I'm at 0.55. And it's amazing how close in that can sometimes come. Now, of course, sometimes there's a big divergence. Some people think Bitcoin goes to zero or whatever, and that's fine. And that's actually even more informative. Okay, so TLDR is the prediction markets may be verification markets, and they may also be, at least put some skin in the game markets, like kind of cool down various things to actually have a resolution to them. And what you get out of this is you get verified digital history of lots and lots of individual feeds that accumulate into something that hopefully eventually approaches like the Google images plus Wikipedia and so on and so forth, right? You've got information streams for these different things. And here's a very important thing. This collection of feeds is what I call the ledger of record, okay? There's also something called like the Akashic, A-K-A-S-H-I-C, okay?
Mm-hmm.
The Akashic records. And this is a concept from, Indian culture, which is like the compendium of all events that have ever occurred in the past, present, or future in terms of all entities and life forms, right? And what's interesting is this ledger of record actually starts to move into that direction. You're writing down on this gigantic global database everything that humans have ever wanted to record. You've also made it undeletable. You've got digital history. And now you can do amazing things. Like if Twitter's database was actually public, there's so many amazing data analyses, visualizations, clients, all the type of stuff you could make out of it if you had an open state backend. And an open state backend is not open source code. It's the next step. Bitcoin is not just open source. It's not just the code is out there. It's open state and open execution. And every user is a root user. Okay, that's very important. Not every user is a root user to the Twitter database. You can't just select all from all tables, right? So every user is equal when it comes to Bitcoin, right? Number one. And so that's open state. Everyone can see the state of the database. And number two, it's open execution where you can run a node and replay every single opcode, right? So it's totally transparent. You don't have a secret ranking algorithm like let's say Twitter or Facebook or whatever has, right? And yet it's still, quote, profitable for someone to deploy their code on chain where the profit is just reduced to the necessary scarcity of the token. Okay, so you still have the pragmatism of, hey, someone needs to eat and you need to fund innovation and so on and so forth without the corporate or state control, which is one of the amazing things about blockchains, right? Okay, so what you have here is something very powerful where you've got an incentive. Just to recap, you have this ledger of record, you have all these different feeds. They're incentivized by different verification markets. So you've got individual subsidization that gets you a collective good, just like individual incentives to make Google images get you Google images collectively, right? And you have now something where you can run scripts over this to get data analyses and print things out. You can, when somebody gives a tweet, you can actually pull context around that. including other entries in the ledger of record that happen in the same time or the same place or by the same person. There's like 1,000 different kinds of queries you can imagine running on this, right? All these streams, happening, from time to time. And because it's event-based, this is a technical point, but there's lots and lots and lots of interesting time series analyses you can do when you start cross-correlating them, understanding A caused B. I think our understanding of like even human events will get better, right? It's kind of like if you ever wanted like the foundation like thing where you could predict the future, knowing the past is actually an important aspect of predicting the future, right? Like the psychohistory type stuff, right? Now here's where things get interesting. Right now, we have essentially 3 kinds of things that can be put on the ledger of record, at least universally. And those are proof of what, proof of when, and proof of who. Namely, proof of what is a hash, proof of when is a timestamp, and proof of who is the digital signature.
Yes.
Right. Now, you might argue with any of one of those, and there's certainly caveats to it. Proof of who doesn't really say who the person is. What it does do is it correlates them to many other on-chain events, of which the identity of Satoshi is like the first such example, right? Where everybody understands the concept of prove your Satoshi by signing someone with a private key, okay? And why does that prove?
Right.
Sorry, go ahead.
So Craig, right? That's a joke. Anyway.
Yeah. Sure. So the reason that works though is because it wasn't just literally one event with Satoshi. It was a bunch of events with provable timestamps where you start to triangulate and be like, okay, only the person who only Satoshi would be the person who had all of these different on-chain events. You see what I'm saying? So the various proof of whens, plus the fact that they were probably all controlled by the same actor, lead to, or signed with the same key, lead to a proof of who. You see what I'm saying? There's an inference thing that you're doing there, which actually can start to get automated, right? You can basically be like, okay, if n independent events that are all signed by the same thing accumulate, it's kind of like it's not 100%, but you can sort of tell whether something's a real Twitter account or a fake Twitter account by their pattern of replies and so on. Even with GPT-3, it's certainly getting good, and maybe it'll eventually pass this, but there's sort of a realistic pattern of human replies, which is still kind of hard to fake, like the timestamps and so on that, right? And so in the near future, an ENS name would be like that. Okay, so you have Marc Hochstein.eth, and that is also interacting with all this stuff in this crypto environment and generating this digital trail, right? Now, you might not want it to be Marc Hochstein.eth. You might want it to be my pseudonym.eth so that you can be provable while still being pseudonymous, like separate out your real name and your name, right? Okay. So today we have proof of what, proof of when, proof of who. But as you know, people are working on lots of other proof of X's, right? Proof of where, proof of solvency, proof of human, proof of this, proof of that. And here's the awesome thing. Whenever one of those proof methods is developed, we've got an entirely new thing which we can cryptographically prove in the ledger of record. A new form of absolute truth that every chain can, they might decide to adopt it over time. It might be like web browsers where you want it, but you have to stage in support over a few years. Those are practical, important, but practical implementation details. The point being, you get amazing leverage out of cryptographic research, right? You get it, right? Once you can do proof of X and proof of Y and proof of Z, so perhaps by chaining together some of these primitives, you can start actually getting mathematically provable, undeletable history. Now, again, there's limitations here because that proof of what, when, and who are really proofs of metadata. They don't say, for example, like when you have a tweet, if you had an on-chain tweet, it would not tell you that the string in it was true. It would tell you that it was very difficult to falsify something at that time from that, like address and with that hash, right? That would be difficult to falsify, but it doesn't tell you the string itself is true, right? That you need other methods for that, but we're getting somewhere, right? At least we're getting some unambiguous facts, unless we think that these are unimportant. Like, why would a timestamp be important? I'll give you 3 or 4 examples. One, several years ago, Elon Musk, basically knocked down a New York Times story, but which purported to show that a Tesla had been stranded on the side of the road by publishing the device logs. Right. And so the timestamps showed that the ride that was reported was not the ride that happened. Okay, number one. Second example, Catherine Wu actually reported this. She showed that in China, in Hangzhou, I believe, there was a court that established priority for one person's patent, or basically one person had invented something before the other, and they had proven it by hashing what they had done on chain. And the court was smart enough to recognize that that was actually a proof of priority. It was very interesting, by the way, is that the state was outsourcing its determination of what was true to the international encrypted network. Very important macro point for later, but the network is becoming the new Leviathan. That is to say, the force that hovers above, the most powerful force in the world, right? A third example is last year with the Brazilian fires. Macron tweeted out, and I'm not attacking Macron here. I'm just saying, he did this or whatever.
President of France?
President of France, yeah, sorry. Macron tweeted out a photo, ostensibly of the Brazilian fires. The New York Times reprinted uncritically. Turns out that when you look at the metadata on that photo, it was from a photographer who had died in 2003. So it's at least 15 years old as a photo. Okay. Now, by the way, if you think about that, that's a good example of sort of, a chain of factual inference, right? You can pull, you do a Google reverse image search, you find the image, you find it's in Getty Images, you find the photographer, you find the photographer's name and birth date, you're cross-referencing a few different things in a proto ledger of record to show that this is unlikely to have happened. And one of the things it's hinging on is it's unlikely that you would have falsified a story about this journalist dying 15 years ago in order to rebut a Brazilian fire thing. That seems unlikely, right? Yes. One of the points here, by the way, is this is why collecting everything that you can in a privacy-preserving way, because people want to be opting into doing this, collecting everything you can gives you, among other things, like ironclad alibis. And it's not obvious what piece of data will be critical in 5 years. Just like who would have known that this, Getty Images file or this article on some journalist dying, as unfortunate, of course, as it is for the guy and his family, or whatever, but who would have known that would be so significant 15 years later? And the reason I say so significant, in the New Republic, there was a guy who was calling for going to war with Brazil, it was the New Republic or the Atlantic. The guy was calling for going to war with Brazil over these images of fires, which were not actually images of the Brazilian fires, right? Yeah. So that's yet a third example of where the metadata, the timestamp, actually prevented something quite bad. Yeah. So, and of course, we've seen, even during COVID, there were these images that were floating around of like Chinese people ostensibly being locked in their rooms, or people falling down the ground and dying. There are images floating around this summer about like mailboxes. All these images are just stripped of context, and you're told that they're coming from place X or place Y, and maybe the person tweeting it believes that, but you have no metadata, you have no way to trace it, track it back. So even just the metadata alone, giving an entry to the ledger record would be big. Okay. Yeah. So that is the ledger of record concept and the concept of oracles that get us absolute truth. And you see, like, basically we're taking a bunch of pre-existing crypto things that exist, but we're stacking and combining them. Yeah. And kind of, we are giving a roadmap, but we're also forecasting where it's going to be 5, 10, 15, 20 years, right? Okay. Now, the next question you might say is, well, okay, Balaji, that's great for a dispassionate record of machine readable facts. By the way, this is an important thing. It's pretty hard to editorialize in the ledger of record because it's literally like JSON data entries. Okay. If you have if you've got a stream of temperature readings, it's like a huge disservice to every script consuming it to suddenly add text fields that are editorializing it or change the data format in some way. So there's actually a small c conservatism in terms of your ability to editorialize that's limited by all the clients that are consuming it or what have you. And there's also alternative feeds that can be put up there where if you really muck up your feed and either refuse to publish some facts or mess with it, people can switch to something else. There's some interesting forms of redundancy built in there. Okay. But of course, there's more to life than just raw streams of data. There's also opinions and so on. So that brings me to the second thing, advocates.
Yes.
Advocates sit above oracles.
Okay.
Advocates consume oracle information and then publish on it. And they can be human or machine, number one. And number two, they can sit on top of other advocates as well. Right. So that's your you have this raw stream, this river of data, and then you have people like refining it in different ways. But here's the critical thing. The critical thing is whether you're, Indian or Pakistani, Israeli or Palestinian, Japanese or Chinese, Democrat or Republican, the Bitcoin blockchain is, everybody agrees on the state of the Bitcoin blockchain.
Yep.
Okay. And that's an incredible thing, where this super contentious thing that people fight wars over, namely who has what property, like that is actually something that everybody sort of dispassionately accedes to because it's cryptography. And that's an amazing accomplishment that we should not underestimate. Like hundreds of billions of dollars is being managed in this way and has for now 10 years. And lots of other properties coming online this way. These are kinds of things that people historically fought about, who holds what when, and we're starting to solve that. We're reducing conflict in human affairs by reducing it to math, right? And when we generalize this to not just all financial instruments, but as I've said with this thing, many kinds of facts can be put on chain. Potentially what we can do is factor out news and opinion, or fact and opinion, in a literally mathematical software programming way, because fact is what is on chain, and opinion is an advocate who's linking to a block explorer, right? Just like you'd link to Wikipedia, you link to effectively Wikidata or Decentralpedia, or whatever we want to call it, right? The ledger of record, the set of all fees. You link to that to prove your case. X happened at Y time, okay, citation needed, on-chain needed, right? And that's just very similar to what people already do. You're not asking for an enormous change in behavior. What you're asking for is those people who are publishing data to publish it on-chain rather than just online, which is like, Chainlink has shown that's already possible. We've got lots of feeds doing that right now. And you're asking for writers to link to a block explorer of a different kind. Now, it will be more fact focused as opposed to transaction focused, right? You could just imagine a different UX. You've seen like Blockchair and stuff like that. There's search engines on top of chain. So just imagine a search engine on top of a fact chain, right? A search engine that is not just looking for transactions but assertions, right? Signed assertions, right? So a search engine on top of a fact chain is actually also, by the way, a medium-term way that Google and so on get disrupted, medium to long-term, because now the index becomes open. It's sort of like if someone put Common Crawl on chain, and again, when I say on chain, it could be IPFS or so on. I just mean a decentralized data store. Now you could build an open source Google. Okay, it wouldn't be trivial. You'd still need to throw compute at it, right? I'm not saying it's easy, but it starts to become more possible because you're starting to amortize the work among a community, right? Common Crawl, by the way, Common Crawl alone helped lead to GPT-3. And so like having these open backends is much bigger deal than people think. Having more eyes being on them would be really huge. Okay. So
the advocate is interpreting, or is sort of opining or editorializing about what's there?
Exactly. The reason I call them advocates is they're humans. So you assume they have an opinion, right? You take the impartiality, or rather than you having humans feign impartiality, right? Which I think is always just feigning it, okay? Especially today. You instead have people be honest and just declare that they're an activist for X or Y or Z, okay? And I actually think that's going to be the flip, right? The flip is going to happen where, in the 20th century, due to centralizing technologies, it favored mass media, mass production, and, mid-century you had one telephone company and two superpowers and three television stations, right? And so technology was highly centralizing then. And so trust was, because there's only one station, you had fairness doctrine, or three stations, whatever, you had fairness doctrine, you had this huge consolidation and centralization. And so everything was sort of forced to the middle of the road, the bell curve, right? The average, the median or whatever, right? And so trust came from basically pretending at least that one was middle of the road, et cetera. And perhaps people were more middle of the road in a genuine way. Now today, trust comes from being authentic and for not feigning that, right? And you're actually seeing this at every place, including at NYT, for example, where they're talking about moral clarity as opposed to right. And you know what? I actually think that that's better than this sort of like pretend neutrality, And what's interesting is both, not to be political, but both left and right think that that's better than pretend neutrality, right? So that's interesting, where you, for different reasons, of course, but that's actually good, right? And So when you're explicit about it, it makes you more trustworthy. I am an advocate for X, discount what I'm saying appropriately. I have skin in the game on Y, W, and Z. I have these disclosures, and I'm going to try to convince you of my position with data and so on, but go ahead and discount it, add whatever grains of salt you want, right? And this is actually, I think just put your cards on the table. It's a much more trustworthy, I think, way of doing it, right? And so that's why I call them advocates. And as I mentioned before, I think that currently lots of outlets monetize on the basis of page views, prestige, and/or profit. Page views being sheer number of views, prestige being approval from one's in-group, Pulse report or whatever, and profit being short-term profit. What I think it's going to move to is a form of venture journalism, where these advocates will advocate for, among other things, technologically progressive causes, what I call investable content. They'll write constructive criticisms of things, and if they are able to fund entrepreneurs through this, let's say, just as a toy example, you have an entrepreneur who comes to your blog on Fusion, your Substack on Fusion, or what have you. You also have subscriptions or whatever to pay the bills on a daily basis, but you have a rolling fund that you've set up through AngelList, okay, because you're a decent, influencer in the space. You have, maybe a few $100,000 in a rolling fund, let's say $500,000. And this person, who's in your community in Fusion, is the best, scientist in the space that you've seen out of all the folks you've spoken to and interviewed and talked about on the topic. And so you're like, okay, I'm going to take a flyer on them. I'm going to put in $50K. For 5% of their company, or if that's $1 million, or if it's at a 5 million valuation, 1% of the company, whatever it is, okay. And then I'm going to introduce them to all the other VCs and venture journalists and angels and so on that I know, and put your human capital, or reputation, saying, hey, I think this person is good. So now what happens? Let's say that actually that is a big win in 5 years or 10 years, and it's 100x. Your 50,000 has just become $5 million. Now, if you have to pay proceeds, of course, back to your rolling fund or what have you, but that's actually something where that's actually why a lot of journalists have become VCs. Not all, it's almost like a boiling off. You know what boiling off is? Like when you, like the hottest molecules escape, from, right? And so what sort of happened is, many journalists, not all, but a lot of the journalists who were not very cynical or hostile or what have you, came over to tech, because they were actually interested in the space and so on and so forth. And, there's ways in which being a journalist is actually very similar to being a venture capitalist. I experienced this to a greater extent earlier this year when I was kind of quasi full-time journalist writing about, Corona, or citizen journalist for sure, writing about Corona. And I got lots of tips and so on. It's actually similar to being a VC, where you're getting dozens, sometimes hundreds of messages in, like a short period of time. And you have to filter them on the basis of like your internal diligence, their past track record, who knows them, blah, 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 all these variables that kind of go into sizing it up. And then you decide, okay, do I include that? Do I amplify it, et cetera? And it's, it's funny is Twitter gives everybody a sense of venture almost, because any tweet could go super viral or not, right. And it's kind of random, so you have that, everyone's accustomed to this jackpot kind of lifestyle, right? Yeah. The difference, of course, is that tweets don't actually pay you money. They just make money for twitter.com, right? Look, I shouldn't say nothing against twitter.com. It's very complicated because Twitter has, I think Paul Graham said it well, it's such high positive and high negative contribution that it's hard to see where it nets out, because I've learned so much from it, but oh my God, there's such like terrible people on there as well, right? Okay, so recursing back up the stack, what that means is these advocates would A, be honest, B, the reason they'd be honest is on-chain or GTFO, right? Like, and by the way, this is actually pretty important because this solves one of the big problems that I've been thinking about since the first half of this year, which is our information supply. People talk about our supply chain, right? Our information supply chain has been completely corrupted in the sense that, like, you just, the process of going from, quote, a study to a publication to a report to a policy to like people, the normal kind of bullshit that we would see around, I don't know, does is red wine good for you or bad for you?
You're right.
Right?
Right.
That kind of stuff multiplied by 1,000 was tons of the early and frankly continuing corona reporting in many ways, and unfortunately what that did was erode lots of people's trust in things
Yes.
when for lots of reasons public health people would say X and then reverse themselves, and very inconsistent things were given out, and people were being told that this was serious, and then public health officials were going into restaurants and acting as if there's nothing there. And here's the thing, like COVID-19 is a real thing. You can see it under an electron microscope.
Yeah.
You can culture it. To my knowledge, it satisfies Koch's postulates, which is to say, there's 4 postulates in virology. It's like being able to culture it, being able to here. Let me actually go and read them. It's it needs to be found in abundance in all organisms suffering from the disease, but non-healthy organisms. It needs to be isolated and grown in pure culture. It needs to be cause disease when introduced into a healthy organism, and it must be able to be re-isolated, right? So the thing is, this is an experiment that anybody can do, and hundreds of people, probably thousands, tens of thousands at this point, have done, which is isolate and culture the virus and proves that it caused transmission pathogenesis, meaning you insert, right? So it's a real thing. And yet, the behavior of these public health officials made people dispute it, right? So our information supply chain is broken, and the traditional, I shouldn't say traditional, the 2 solutions that are on the table are A, trust the state, or B, trust no one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Both of those are horrible ideas, because trust the state is just like, trust people who are just making it up and wildly swinging from one thing to another, no masks, whatever, without any acknowledgement or humility or resignations or retractions or accountability whatsoever, and in a tone of holy sanctimony the whole way, right? And then the other side, trust no one, make it up as you go along. Well, that's also not going to land you in a great position, because it's not just COVID, of course. It's something where, you're implicitly trusting someone every time you buy some food, that it's not like contaminated or whatever. A truly low trust society is a horrible place to live, because everybody's trying to cheat you, right? Okay. So I think the answer is thinking from the very core principle of like, what is science? Okay. There's an awesome paper that came out last year, which helps to sort of, though they didn't phrase it quite this way, it helps to sort of refound science on computer science and stats in the following sense, okay? Everything that we know about physics, much of classical physics is in the language of partial differential equations. For example, Maxwell's equations or the Schrodinger equation, these are things where there's an assumed continuum, Navier-Stokes, et cetera, right? And the thing about that, though, is those partial differential equations are an inference based on data. Okay, ultimately, they're scatter plots that people squinted at back before they could collect a lot of data, by the way. They squinted at it, and they were able to put together Faraday's law and Ampere's law and so on and so forth. And then Maxwell, for example, was able to generalize all of these into Maxwell's equations, right? And so if you go back far enough, people are actually doing like inclined plane experiments and recording individual data points, okay? Now, an awesome concept is, what if everything like that was also on chain? What if our scientific supply chain was on chain, such that when you were citing a paper, it was like importing code, right? That's totally possible. That's completely possible, because
so the data collected in the experiment is recorded on chain.
Yes. Now, this is actually called reproducible research. There's a name for it, okay? I actually did it in grad school. It's like 20 years old, okay? You can go and look at Jupyter, Jupyter. You can go and look at Sweave, which is an R. And there's a package called OrgBabel in org mode that does this for different languages, okay? And the point is that the PDF is really an end product. What you really want to release also is the code and the data. In the same way, for example, when you refresh Facebook or Twitter, as an engineer, you're templating that web page with variables from a database. Okay, you're templating it with your that person's face and their followers and their likes and whatever, right? And in the same way, you can think of a PDF for a paper as being templated with the data from the paper and the calculations to calculate, the p-values or the graphs or charts, tables, whatever in that, right? And the thing that's so important is when you can see the code, there's lots of things that are often not articulated in the text, like particular parameter choices, or how you pick the bins for the histogram. Lots of these little things that actually often do matter to someone trying to reproduce it. When you look at the code and you look at the data, the paper is really downstream of that. And here's the thing, that's what every scientific study is. It is collecting data and doing some calculations and then writing it up, right? So it's the data, it's the code, it's the paper. Now, currently, this is mostly operative in, or reproducible research started in like stats and bioinformatics and so on, where the data sets were big and it was purely stats and so on. But now there's this paper that came out last year called AI Feynman, which is really good, which showed that you could take the Feynman lectures on physics, and they took 100 equations from the Feynman lectures on physics and were able to actually synthesize data as if it came from those equations, and then actually recapitulate the equations themselves using a form of symbolic regression, okay? And it's actually, the algorithm they describe, it's actually a very elegant paper, very well done by Max Tegmark and his graduate student. And what's cool about this is it shows that the computer science and stats approach can actually be generalized to other domains, okay? Now, why is that important? Well, it suggests that in the early 20th century, physicists went in and they imperialized every other domain. Basically, you went into, I don't know, plastics or whatever, and you're like, yeah, you're doing your extrusion moles wrong. Let me write down Navier-Stokes, and we'll do this better, right? Or a famous example is in biology, where Luria and Delbruck went in and they just did something that a lot of biologists hadn't done, which they started counting, and they came up with their famous discoveries like Luria-Delbruck experiment and so on. And the point is that physics and like sort of continuous models and so on was huge in the early 20th century, and now it's computer science and stats. Why? Because every field has data structures. If you're doing traffic, right? Like, okay, you've got cars and you've got lanes and you've got stop signs and whatever, right? If you're doing I don't know, like food preparation, you have like shelves and you have ingredients and whatnot. Every space has data structures, okay? And if it's got data structures and algorithms, you record them and they're in databases, so you get stats. Okay, so you have algorithms and data structures, that's computer science and stats. So it's a different way of just kind of going into any field. I mean, whether it's Walmart or whether it's Barnes and Nobles or a laundromat or something, they're going to have customer records, going to have tables of data, and you can start doing scatter plots and histograms and correlations. So it's like a general skill that you can apply everywhere, right? But we can apply it not just all of these applied commercial areas, but actually to pure science itself. And so here's what's super awesome. Now, when someone says, oh, quote, scientists say, you say on-chain or GTFO, okay? Right. Show me the truly permalink. The truly permalink is the on-chain link to the code, the data, and the paper, which is uneditable, it's archived, you can't muck with it, okay? And it itself has links, which are import statements, back to all the papers it cites that it actually uses in the text. By the way, this is something which any real scientist, of which I, just for your listeners or whatever, I spent many years in academia before getting into crypto. I don't usually talk physics on Twitter, but I know a little bit. The thing about this is any real scientist wants their data to be public, wants their experiments to be reproducible, wants to build on the work of others, wants to be correct, not simply prestigious or whatever, right? And there's lots of real scientists out there, and these are people who are pushing for reproducible research and open access and so on, right? So there's a genuine movement in academia for this. It's an organic thing that already exists. What we want to do is push that further so that every paper is open access, so otherwise it's not reproducible if it isn't. Every paper is reproducible research. Again, it's not reproducible if it isn't. And it cites other papers that are. And now anybody can reproduce things, because here's the critical thing, right? We have, when you talk about expertise or what have you, in your house, you don't have a wind tunnel, you don't have an inclined plane, you don't have a cloud chamber, but what you do have is a computer capable of doing billions of calculations per second. And anything we can reduce to math, you can replicate in your home. And this is why I say, it's kind of a funny way of phrasing it, but that's why I say math greater than science. Okay. Why do I say that? Well, first is math is greater than quote unquote science, which is like the nonsense abusive science that people put out there. And but math is greater than even normal science because math is fully rigorous and it's completely reproducible. And of course, there's limitations of computer circuits. They're not completely ideal, but they're very close in the sense that the calculations are extremely, extremely, extremely accurate. Yeah. And so this is actually the same logic as crypto. What crypto did is it took science, like the Nobel Prize Memorial in economic sciences, right? Like economics is called science. It took economic science and turned into economic math because it decentralized it to households. And, this is, by the way, sort of one of the great things about Western culture is it does have this decentralized renewal built into it whenever a centralized institution just gets too big for its britches, right? Like the Protestant Reformation. Boom, 95 Theses, decentralize away from the Catholic Church and get an alternative, there's a lot of chaos that came out of that. I'm not saying it was all good, right? But there is that aspect of, decentralize, exit, reboot, anew, refresh when the existing thing is broken. And this, I feel, is just another iteration of that where we, bam, 95 Theses, the data must be open or GTFO with the paper. And the reason this is so important, by the way, just to give it from another angle, is there's so many people who are stealing the prestige of Maxwell's equations for some sketchy data analysis. Okay, Maxwell's equations have billions, trillions, countless numbers of independent replications. Every time you hold up your phone, like you're basically doing a replication. The fact that you can connect to the towers and so on. They've done the beam forming with the antennas and so on. That's replicating it, right? Whereas some sketchy data analysis that came out last week simply hasn't had that many independent replications, or in the language of crypto, that many independent confirmations.
Yep.
Boom, right? So what we're doing here is we're taking a lot of the concepts that have been proven over the last 10 years in crypto, independent confirmations, open data, right? Cryptographic verification, all these things where we've seen how important they are, and now extending them to our full information supply chain. Okay, let me pause there.
Gotcha. So,
that's a big download. I know a lot of stuff, but
and I want to be respectful of your time. We got a half hour left, and there's a couple of things. But one last thing on oracles and advocates. Then, so let's say 10 years from now, this structure is in place where you have oracles and advocates, and you have all these feeds coming on chain. Or let's say even a counterfactual where we had this already in 2020. So how would the pandemic have gone differently? Like what does that counterfactual look like?
Okay, so first is we would have been able to know. So like I'll give several things, right? So first, you'd know whether the videos and images and so on coming out of China were legitimate or not because you have metadata on all of these images.
Yeah.
Okay, that itself is big because you can actually kind of prove, because actually there was somebody in our community, Jill Carlson, who had a tweet, which is, she was like, I will date the pandemic. She wasn't calling it that at the time because it wasn't yet known that it was a pandemic as opposed to an epidemic, right? She's like, I'll date this as the time that my trust in any video I saw on the internet just broke down. I didn't know if it was real or not, right? So because it exists in that nether realm of could be real or not, people just didn't act on it because it was uncertain, right? So that's one. Number two, very important, why is COVID-19 so hyper variable? Why is it that Wuhan and Italy and New York were just wrecked by this, but other places had not been, or now they are today? Maybe it's just a number of trials. People have speculated things like, oh, these are countries that have this vaccination versus that. But if you think about it from a stats perspective, okay, what you really want is what I call the big table, okay? The big table, and this is not even the biggest table, but the big table is something where every row is a person, and you have all the columns of data on them, like, are they healthy or do they have COVID? What's their temperature today, yesterday, et cetera. Now, of course, many of those cells are going to be hidden for privacy reasons, good reasons, et cetera, okay? However, a lot of the data is being collected now in, Fitbit and things like that, right? It's siloed and broken up among this hospital and that medical record and whatnot. Okay, so with patient consent, because that is important, okay, you could allow people to opt in to share their data. Why? Because if you share your data, you might give to get. Okay, the thing about medical data is, of course, it's medical, so it's private, but it's also statistical, so it benefits dramatically from aggregations. So there's ways of doing, for example, privacy preserving aggregations. Google's published some papers on this. Federated machine learning is one concept where basically a lot of machine learning is about accumulating counts. Whether you're doing linear or logistic regressions, you're accumulating a bunch of counts and then putting them into kind of estimating your coefficients at the top. And that can be parallelized across nodes. Then you can add on top of that methods for homomorphic encryption, where you are not even, the cloud doesn't even see what each individual number is. It's seeing like a digest of it, it's adding them all together, and it's undigesting them or sending them back down to be undigested locally. And so it's like it can add up and subtract and do other things with numbers where it doesn't even know what the individual nodes are. So it's an even better approach, right? And there's folks who are trying to commercialize that. Craig Gentry had the first breakthrough on that many years ago, but it's improved a lot since then. When you start thinking in this way, this is the second thing. So the first one I mentioned was with ledger record, you get metadata and photos. The second one, you actually get genuine biomedical data sharing, because rather than all these individual hospital feeds, you have like data sets that researchers, anybody in the world, can access if those patients have granted the appropriate permissions, right? And so you just like your Facebook data, I mean, it's a pain in the ass certainly to set the permissions or whatever, but you might also get something where you opt in and the pharma company will pay you a piece for being part of the study, right? Like, hey, you got COVID, well, guess what? At least we'll pay you, I don't know, X $100 to you to look at your data to help other people also not get COVID and help you, right? I think that's a reasonable deal. Not everyone will take it, but make sure it's consensual. Okay. So now what you've got is a mechanism for doing data aggregation. Now, again, scientists already do this. It can be called meta-analysis, where you're just like taking a bunch of individual studies and like trying to get p-values and stack the p-values. I don't really like that much. There's a better approach, which sometimes goes by the name of data fusion, where rather than calculating p-values from individual studies and then combining them, instead you actually stack the rows of each study. Okay, this is often done in bioinformatics. What you find when you do that, by the way, is you often have so-called batch or study effects, which you have to correct for. That is to say, like, there's just, I don't know, maybe the humidity was different in this set of gene expression data versus this one, and so that actually dominates the effects there, and so you have to kind of correct and normalize for that. Okay. And there's various techniques to do this, but the point is that data fusion does work. It does get you, done right, it does get you more signal than any individual data set by itself, so long as the columns match up. And if you've got a blockchain or kind of decentralized database, you have an incentive for various hospitals to line up their columns. The way of thinking about that is, whether it's Coinbase or it's Binance or it's Kraken, they all use the same fields in Bitcoin for the most part, right? It sort of forces everybody to use the same fields, right? So if you had a blockchain EMR, I know that sounds jargony, it will eventually happen. It literally might take to like 2040 for it to happen, okay? Yeah. But that will eventually happen, and then you actually get defined columns. There may be different options, of course. Maybe just like there's Ethereum versus Bitcoin, whatever, there may be different options for this blockchain EMR. So that's a second huge thing you get, where you get a clean data set. And now what do you get from that? You can now root cause. Why is COVID hypervariable? I've got 30 hypotheses. Now I can actually test each of them, or at least observationally, right? Currently, the only things that people can test observationally are these massive aggregates. They're like, oh, the Germans are doing good and these folks are not, right? Or these countries wear masks and these aren't, or these countries have this vaccine and these don't. And they're doing these like super aggregated things, national level aggregates. But if you know some stats, there's something called Simpson's paradox, where working with aggregates can actually obscure and sometimes even reverse the sign of the correlation or the relationship when you're working with the individual rows of data. So, and that's just like one of many things where like working with the big aggregates can be misleading. Not always, but it can be, you know? And so I see people fighting on Twitter, and, you know, like it's something where, look, observational data at the country level, I'm not saying it doesn't have any importance, I am, however, saying that it's a extremely coarse-grained resolution relative to what we could do. All right, so that's number two. And number three, actually, in some ways, because number two is actually getting the data together to do the studies, and then number three is actually finding the cause of hypervariability. Number four is that this is a little bit harder to prove, but I do think that we would get much better prevention as well, because quantified self would go on chain. And there's things like the health radar that Kinza did. Okay, I think it's like KINSA, if I got that right. Kinza health thermometer. Okay, they've got like a health map. KINSA health map. Okay, and healthweather.us. There's companies that have done stuff like this where essentially they've got a bunch of smart thermometers. They've got 1 million smart thermometers in the US, and they just kind of look for where temperature seems to be spiking, and that's a way to track kind of COVID sloshing around, right? Now, if you had the ledger of record where you have a bunch of feeds like this, and nothing against Kinza, it's a good company. I know the founder a little bit. I'm not an investor, but good company. But if you had a bunch of those, and you had Ura's data, and you had Fitbit's data, and you had the Apple Watch data, and you had so on, and a lot of the data was on chain, and then some set of it was selectively decrypted, to either researchers or people who would pay, you've got a pretty interesting data set for monitoring and prevention as well, right? So, a lot of these things are fundamentally informational problems. Why is COVID what it is? I mean, for example, I'll give one more example of an informational problem. The Moderna vaccine. I mean, anybody who knows like bio knows, they essentially synthesize it in a couple of days because they're just using a template that they had the coronavirus genome pretty quickly, and you could get it in a couple of days. We could probably, by the way, have tested that vaccine in challenge trials in like February. And challenge trial is basically you synthesize it, you got a vaccine, and you just have soldiers or somebody healthy or folks volunteer, and they just they get the vaccine, whether it's oral or nasal, whatever, and then you expose them to corona, and you have a hospital there in case they actually get sick. And the reason that's so much faster than observational trials is, and it's also much higher signal, is who is exposed versus not. You don't need to do placebo controls, right? Now, of course, the ethics of doing this are some people might die from corona. On the other hand, you also have the hospital right there. You have the best of care. And frankly, far fewer people would have died if we had done that, because you would have instantly known whether you would have had no shortage of volunteers. Okay, and probably function side, no shortage of volunteers. So you have the vaccine manufactured right away. The critical thing, though, from the vaccine is not even the manufacturing, at least the mRNA one. Others are easier or harder. The critical part is the information of knowing whether it works or not and what its side effects are and so on. And so that information could have been gathered very rapidly in a competent society that did challenge trials. And we're probably going to want to do that. Some society will have to get competent because whether it's COVID or another pandemic, something will probably come back at some point, either a mutated COVID. I mean, I know it sucks for the viewers at home, but it maybe just goes away. A vaccine kills it, and it's less mutable than the flu, considerably so. So there's folks who hypothesize it, but it's also got a lot of shots on goal. It's got millions and millions of people around the world that's infected, so it's doing this huge parallel search of the genome for mutations that'll let it bypass a vaccine or bypass a treatment. And we can never just write that off. It could absolutely happen. So that gives a few ways in which better information in general could help us, as well as 3 specific ways in which on-chain data, ledger of record could help. Maybe helpful. I'm never sure how technical I should go, but I think it's useful to give this level of detail for some of the folks in the audience.
Yeah, for sure. That's great. So again, I've got a whole bunch of things here I wanted to hit on. So let me. So going back to media. So I do feel like I want to address this incident with the Recode reporter.
Yes.
So why respond on Twitter rather than directly to them?
Well, the thing is that I've now got enough experience in this where, I mean, You can tell very quickly
Yeah.
what somebody's slant or angle is with a story
Yeah.
from A, the outlet, B, that reporter's tweets or past publications,
Mm-hmm.
and C, the tone of their approach or what have you, right? And I think a lot of journalists, I should say corporate journalists as opposed to citizen journalists, but a lot of corporate journalists are, how like little kids will play as if they're like spies by like covering their eyes and saying, I'm invisible,
Yeah.
like that, right? Lots of corporate journalists think that their subjects don't read all their tweets,
Mm-hmm.
right? And here's the thing, like anybody who's smart reads all the tweets of any journalist who reaches out, enough of the past articles, and you form a profile of who that person is and what they do, you know? And like Recode, like many of the tech outlets, is basically a glorified gossip column that doesn't know the first thing about coding, investing, or managing, and just writes lots of hate pieces on tech. It essentially pivoted from being a gadget reviewer to some kind of Gestapo. And so it was like pretty obvious that like given those priors, plus like the context of the approach, that it was going to be a negative piece. Now, the second thing is, why did I respond on Twitter rather than directly? Well, it's something where it's very if somebody's telegraphing that they're going to punch you and they're winding up like this and like, I'm going to punch you,
Mm-hmm.
it's pretty dumb to be like, okay, I'll wait for the punch and then spit out my teeth or whatever. No, the answer is like either get out of the way, block the punch, or be like, hey, this guy's trying to punch me, and point to the crowd and so on, right? And so the entire model of like, I'm gonna put him on the spot and hold him accountable and have this evil corporation or person, like I'm gonna ask them for a response and put the microphone to them and they're gonna give it to me. That only holds in an era where your quote subject is actually a subject as opposed to a citizen journalist of their own with their own distribution and their own following, and the entire concept of a quote subject, as a journalist and subject, recalls the alternative definition of subject, like a king and their subjects, right? Or like subject to, or the subject of the experiment.
Mm-hmm.
And like, folks like us, we're not like things under the microscope to be documented for, the doings of the Silicon Valley elite or whatever, this person wrote. So these corporate journalists don't actually conceptualize their subjects as being fully human beings. They think of them as targets, and because of that, you don't just wait for their Bronze Age style of warfare where they're going to like telegraph the swing and then
Mm-hmm.
punch you. Instead, you just blow up their spot. You first strike, you call out the story, you say what it actually is, and they're always like, oh, I can't believe you did that, because what you did is you broke their script where you stand there and they punch you. No, I don't think that's how it goes anymore, right? I'm not here, we're not here to be grist for their shitty content mill, right? In fact, we're going to deter them from doing this, and we're going to basically fact check the crap out of these articles, which are written. I mean, in particular, this one was particularly egregious because this person and this outlet had no biomedical background whatsoever, and were attempting to like show not just me up, but like all these biotech VCs who have founded and built 100 million, like just it was like an ant crawling up an elephant's leg with rape on its mind. Okay, like just an absolute arrogance and lack of humility, frankly, by people who don't know and don't know that they don't know. And so, absolutely not. We're not going to wait for them to to slug us. That era is totally over.
So the one of I want to move on from this in a second. But the one argument I could see for taking the call or whatever would be, even if it's going to be a hit piece, even if it's conceived as a hit piece, if you talk to them, there's at least a chance that you can influence the outcome of the story, and that maybe they can actually rethink. They'll actually, if they listen to you, they will rethink the premise.
Yeah, but I'm three thoughts on that. First is, I think pre-2013, that was a more reasonable strategy, right? Where you actually had, like since 2013, since the beginning of the tech lash, right? Media companies and their culture is to treat tech companies as the enemy and people who they want to, quote, take down or hold accountable. All the prizes, all the culture is built on dunking on the tech bros and tech brain and so on and so forth, right? Like this is basically a bunch of woke whites in Brooklyn attacking people who are very largely, if not majority, immigrant, right? By the way, but the thing about it is, pre-2013, I think that would have been reasonable, right? Because these folks understood something of, the older school reporter understands something of carrot and stick, right? The older school reporter also, wasn't as incentivized by Twitter to just demonize for clicks. Because what Twitter does is it trains you to strip context, add exclamation marks. By the way, so to be very clear, I put a ton of the blame on social media. I think Facebook gets way more crap than Twitter. Facebook gets 10x as much crap than Twitter, but Twitter is 10x worse than Facebook for this. And I think one of the reasons that is that the bad actors on Twitter are the ones beating up Facebook, but they're actually the bad actors on Twitter. Okay. Blue checks have set a very bad example on Twitter, where the blue check was initially for someone to realize that they were not being imitated, okay, or like not being mimicked, that there wasn't an imposter account, but it became a mark of prestige because the kind of accounts that are not being imitated are the ones that are often important in some way, right? And so the fact that blue checks modeled this extremely negative form of discourse brought down the quality on Twitter and led to this feedback loop where to gain status was to be very negative, polarizing, et cetera. And by the way, this is mathematical, okay? You can go and create scatter plots that show that the more angry words, MAGA words, woke words, whatever, that you put into your copy, it boosts clicks. Nick Kristof, who's, an older school journalist, I don't agree with everything he writes, but I feel that at least he has a degree of intellectual honesty, actually wrote an article last year titled, I think it was like the articles no one reads. And he disclosed that if he writes about some worthy project in, like the developing world, that gets like X number of clicks. But if he writes about Trump, that gets literally 10X the number of clicks, okay? Now here's the thing, Nick Kristof, again, I don't agree with everything he writes, but he actually wrote the article that inspired Gates to go and do these flush toilets, or these rather non-flush toilets, these decentralized toilets basically in the developing world. I may be butchering that, but it's from like the Netflix special, okay? But Gates came up with, or funded people to come up with new models of toilets that you could actually go and put out there in places where there wasn't functioning sewage systems. And so Kristof did a lot of good with that article that didn't get a lot of traffic, but had like the right reader, namely the Gates. This gets back to the point I was talking about earlier, where you're optimizing for the very highest quality reader, right? Now they're optimizing for the highest quantity readers, Kristof being an unusual one. And one thing I found interesting is how many of these corporate journalists like refuse to admit that they're driven by page views or driven by clicks. And yet, of course, at a minimum, they're looking at their number of RTs and their number of likes, which are absolutely a proxy for number of page views. And they're looking at that all the time and are hyper conscious of it. And so the answer is A, pre-2012 may have been more reasonable, not anymore. B, you have to also think about the iterated game of it, right? Like if bad behavior is rewarded with supplication, you just get more bad behavior, right? It's literally like, I mean, it's like the being bullied in high school or whatever. Once you handed over some lunch money and you're like, hey, bully, can I cooperate with you next time? Maybe it's just 50 cents or whatever. They're just going to keep taking your lunch money, right? However, unfortunately, if you can cause them more pain than they're trying to cause you, that's actually a deterrent, right? And it's unfortunate that you have to do that. But like, it's very clear if you read their Twitter feeds that these people think of technology as the enemy and are dehumanizing a disproportionately, by the way, an industry that is about 20 or 30 points less white than journalism. Again, that's not everything. I'm not the kind of person who like goes on about that all the time, but it is true. They're dehumanizing this group of people who writes the code, who builds the vaccines, who does the drug development, does the genetic tests, builds the robots. And then they expect you to play by Marquis of Queensberry rules when they're just like firing with an Uzi. No, not reasonable anymore.
Yeah. Okay. We're running short on time. I can keep going, but if you want to stop and
I can go a little bit longer. Sure.
Okay, great. Okay. One more thing I want to go back to on COVID, because I feel it's important to hit upon. So, and I don't want to misrepresent your
Sure.
political views, but I suspect there is at least a libertarian streak to your worldview. But so there's a lot of people, and I think, I think this is a result of the sort of distrust of experts that we were talking about, and that sort of the trust no one scenario. But how do you feel about anti-maskers, particularly that a lot of them are, some of them are actually in the crypto community, some of them are definitely in that sort of libertarian community, because you obviously understand the virus very well. But what do you think of these sort of people who are refusing to wear masks and skeptical about coronavirus being a thing to this day?
So, man, it's a very complicated topic. So first of all, I think you should wear a mask, and I think coronavirus is real. Okay,
Yes.
Number one. Number two is I think that the reason that those people feel like that is because like public health officials and the press and quote unquote scientists have done such a poor, contradictory, condescending, non-skin in the game way of communicating. When you go and see like Gavin Newsom going and having a dinner outside, right, or quote outside, but actually indoors, when you see Nancy Pelosi going to her hairdresser or whatever, it shows them that the political elites who are imposing these restrictions on their businesses and their way of life are not taking it seriously and are not wearing masks. And therefore, these people who often don't have technical degrees say COVID isn't real, right? So I put a huge amount of the blame on our political actors, frankly, and that's by the way, that's Democrat, that's Republican, that's a totally equal opportunity indictment of essentially the entire political class, who is filled with lawyers and people who can manipulate political realities, and they themselves are so used to saying one thing and then doing another that they don't realize Corona is actually real. Okay, now there's another aspect to it, which is another thing that's also real about Corona, at least as far as we can see, is it's got a hyper variable outcome distribution. There's some people who, now it does skew to be much more severe as people get older. That part we do know. But there's a huge variability in symptoms where some people, as we know, die. Some people are like have permanent lung damage. Some people have like weird neuralgia and like post-viral syndromes and so-called long haul COVID. They don't get better. And actually quite a few of my friends have reported something like that. So that's something where, I mean, these are people who don't know each other, individually. They're not malingerers. They're actually like ultra fit people, many of them. And I know like 4 or 5 people who've had COVID in my circle of, I don't know, 1,000 people who I know, who have reported these kinds of long haul symptoms. I haven't done the exact denominator, so don't take that religiously. Okay. And it may be something where I actually know 10,000 people and I'm sort of overestimating the numerator versus the denominator. So like, that's why I take it very much with a grain of salt. Okay. But I do know that there's at least a seemingly non-trivial number of folks with long haul COVID, both in personal experience and in the literature and in these support groups, which have hundreds of thousands of people who at least think they have long haul COVID. And then finally, of course, there's folks like Trump who seem to just shrug it off, and 70 years old, and for him it really was just the flu, quote unquote, right? And so that's, I think, a second reason is there's a genuine huge variation in these symptoms, and for many people they're going to heavily weight the personal experience of the people near them, and if they had severe or non-severe cases, how it's going to turn out, right? So to be clear, I'm not I'm not defending what I would consider an irrational decision to not wear masks or go to the stuff. But I'm saying why it's happening is due to terrible leadership. And by the way, in other countries, like Asian countries, they haven't turned it into this silly political clickbait exercise where on the one side you have people who say it's not real, and on the other side you have people who give lip service to it and still act like it's not real. Instead, they actually are totally serious about it, where you get off the plane and they quarantine you in Asia for actually 2 weeks. You cannot leave your room. It's like an actual quarantine. They require a test before you get on the plane. They require a test after you get off the plane. They have central quarantine if you ever test sick, so you're not like just running around your apartment. They have temperature checks in public locations, blah, blah. Like they're actually like for real about it, And because they're for real, they have a functional society. And by the way, so this is actually said, a libertarian streak and said, I mean, like, it's funny. I think that like if there's one political leader that I admire, it's Lee Kuan Yew. Okay. And the reason is Lee Kuan Yew was fundamentally a pragmatist. And there's things that Singapore does that are libertarian-ish. There's things they do that are conservative-ish. There's things they do that are very progressive-ish or very statist or nanny-statist, whatever. But the thing is that I feel that a lot of these political ideologies describe axes where you can set a slider, and the Western style, this is one of the disadvantages of Western style, is like ramming it all the way to one axis or another. And it's like argued as like a holy thing, And in practice, it's like when you start a company, you have some theory about how the world should work, but then in practice, you have to set a particular slider, like how much equity do you give your employees, for example, right? You can, give all employees equity, or, like you have to have some for later cohorts or the invest, like that's an empirical decision, and it's going to actually differ for different cohorts of people, even under different circumstances. And that's how I think about like government parameters, like how coercive versus how like, volitional you should be. I understand the ethical argument for volition. I think that's probably also gets, from a utilitarian standpoint, the right answer much of the time. But I also recognize that in situations like, let's say, vaccination, that there's an argument for, for coercion, because if there's a segment of the population that doesn't want to get vaccinated for a vaccine that works, let me come back to this point because that's a very important asterisk, that last proviso, okay? If there's a segment that doesn't want to get vaccinated for a vaccine that works, that becomes a disease reservoir where the virus can just mutate and churn or whatever, and then reinfect the rest of the population. It's not simply an individual decision. You're making a decision for the whole community, right? Now, the flip side of this is that extremely important premise, namely asterisk, a vaccine that works. And the problem, one of the hugest problems, is because you have these people who have gone to like, dinners and gone, like that, it's like the first duty of a politician is optics or whatever, and they've just completely messed it up and made people not believe that this is real, right? So they're one thing, do one thing. They couldn't do that one thing, So because of that, there's anti-vax sentiment on the left and the right, which seemed just like another stupid thing of America in 2019, is now like a potentially very serious thing for the vaccine rollout. I don't know how that's going to go. Maybe it'll be a non-issue and people will actually just take the vaccine. Maybe folks will say, hey, vaccines are drugs, and why are you telling me that I'm supposed to be super skeptical of drug companies and drugs and have all these regulations and so on for them, but then super unskeptical of vaccines and just trust them, et cetera, because a vaccine is a drug, right? Now, by the way, that contradiction can be argued both ways. You can argue both, as the anti-vax folks will tend to do, to not trust vaccines because they're from drug companies, or you can argue a different angle, which is, hey, actually, maybe we should have liberalized drugs and so on as well, and give a little more leeway and actually push harder on making them faster, right? So that contradiction holds in both directions. I just want to point out that contradiction. Moreover, there's a more rational anti-vax type person who says, well, I believe vaccines work, but I'm not sure about this vaccine. And that's actually, Kamala Harris said something like that. She's like, if Trump approves a vaccine, then I'm not going to take it, right? So people who just in a cussed, do you see that one, right? Yeah. And it's like, look, I can't excuse that sentiment. I understand it because of the insane politicization of everything, right? But that's not someone who's anti-vax. That's anti this vax, right? And so I don't know. I don't know how it's going to land up. I think that one of the reasons that I haven't written about it as much recently is it got so politicized that you realize that people in America, at least, or the West, certainly in English language, the UK and other places, New Zealand seems okay. Australia seems okay. They seem to be doing better, at least. I think it might be the Asian influence, frankly, that like other people, your peer group is how you kind of take it, right? And but English language internet seems more interested in fighting with each other than solving this problem, or taking it seriously. So I don't know what happens. Maybe it kind of fizzles, like the election was sort of hyped as this big, Fight Club thing that was going to happen afterwards, and kind of fizzled on that. Hopefully, I mean, the thing is that because these are private companies, frankly, I trust them much more than the public sector.
Mm-hmm.
And these are I mean, with Moderna and Oxford and Pfizer, we've got multiple vaccines. Papers look good from what I've seen. I mean, the sample sizes are not humongous necessarily for the ones that have but I'm not criticizing anything. I'm just saying that, we'll see what happens on it. I would take a vaccine from one of these companies. I think they're very legit. I want to see whether other people do it, because that'll be a big signal as to whether this fizzles, like the election, the anti-vax sentiment, or whether it's a huge problem that you have to deal with. Because what you don't want is to be stuck with a choice between a huge disease reservoir with the vaccine spiraling and mutating within millions of citizens versus coercive vaccination. That just pushes us into a different realm where I hope the country doesn't go. I hope the data is good enough. And this is where the information thing comes. If the trust hadn't been, pushed down to such an extent with this bad behavior by politicians, there'd be a trust bank to draw from when you say, trust us, this is going to work for you.
Yeah.
I know it's a long answer, but it's a complicated topic. Go ahead.
Well, that was really salient. Okay, so I wanted to make sure we hit on this. So what is next for you? What are you working on now, and what's coming up?
A lot of the stuff on truth and so on that I've been talking about here, I've been thinking about how to roll out there. There's other aspects of it as well. Probably it'll be like an open source project of some kind, but we'll see. I'll probably announce it when I'm ready. So.
Gotcha. Do you have a couple? Just let me know when you need to jump.
Okay.
So
I do a couple more, whatever. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Let's do a couple more. Maybe talk a bit about looking back on 21 and on earn.com and your time at Coinbase. What are your biggest lessons? What are your biggest accomplishments from that period?
Yeah. So I think biggest accomplishments, Coinbase Earn, since you asked, has actually been very successful. If you go to Coinbase, it's first, it's heavily featured in the app and on the homepage and so on because it's working, right? It's Coinbase's highest rated individual offering because everybody makes money when using it. And, you can literally click buttons and make money, right? And educates people. It just has a really, I think it's done extremely well. And I'm not sure if they've given out the numbers on it, but millions of people have earned crypto through it. Tens of millions of dollars of crypto have been earned through it. And, Stellar alone put $100 million worth of Stellar into the program last year. That was announced. I think you may have saw that. And the Coinbase Earn, the integration, basically did hundreds of millions of dollars in sales in its first year. So there's this huge pile of crypto that we can use for onboarding, that we're using for onboarding, and it's gone, I think, extremely well. In fact, it's gone so well that CoinMarketCap cloned Earn, and they have, CoinMarketCap Earn, and they in fact have the exact same language and the same font, like Learn Crypto and Earn Crypto, which is, the copy that I typed out several years ago. So it's actually, that's the saying, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, right? So they've also seen the numbers. Basically, the reason that Earn has been so successful is all these crypto projects, if they want to attract users, they often can't run ads on Google or Facebook, right? And if they did, even if they could, they'd have to liquidate their crypto to get USD to pay Google and Facebook, which would harm all their existing holders, right, to acquire customers. And then what do? They're basically going to redirect you to Coinbase or an exchange anyway. So, then there's another conversion at the end of the funnel, right? So instead, by going directly to us, or to Coinbase rather, Coinbase is a crypto-aware channel, right, that could take $10 million in a cryptocurrency, award it to users who would value it as $10 million, and in fact, hodl it rather than liquidating it. And that might make the price go up over the long term, though crucially, every person who held it would have used the currency or the token or whatever prior to buying any of it, right? So you also get something that's very useful for projects, which is namely a demonstration that 1 million people used the thing and watched videos on why it was useful before buying it, which is actually like a track record of utility. So it solves another problem for them, which is like establishing utility. You can see what's distinctive about it. It does a purpose. It's used for this VR world, or it's used for storing files, and then you buy it on that very obvious basis as like an API key, right? So because of that, it's like the largest scaled customer acquisition channel in crypto. And one of the things that makes it work is like being able to determine whether someone's actually real or not. That's like a huge aspect of it, because otherwise you get lots of fake accounts set up where people try to take the money or whatever. So that's been, I'm very proud of that. And actually I was also an investor in cameo.com, which is probably going to be a unicorn doing extremely well. And that was actually something where I got in touch with them, because early in Earn, we had some of the same folks on there, and they were thinking Earn would be a competitor potentially. But like my thinking then, and my thinking now, and my thinking generally is I'm a positive sum person, and I felt like they were going to do something quite different. And I felt tasking in the Earn sense is not a company; it's like an industry, like social is. And so like if you look at Gitcoin and stuff like that, I think you're going to see tasking be as huge by 2030 or 2035 as social media is. I think we're still in the early days of it, still building the infra from it. And I think Earn is one of the first to prove that at the scale of basically hundreds of millions of dollars. Again, I'm not sure all the stats have gone out there, but I'm giving the stuff which has been public. You can see like the Stellar deals and other deals that are out there. So that's what I'm proud of.
And the revenue model for Earn, like, so Stellar contributes the crypto to give to people for learning about Stellar, but then like they pay Coinbase a fee for the privilege.
I think it depends on the project. When I was there, we didn't charge fees directly because it was just win-win-win for all parties. Like it was a win for Coinbase because our customers were happy. It was a win for the customers because they got free crypto, right? Or not really free, they had to earn it, but it was like relatively, fun to earn. And it was a win for the projects because they got highly qualified users, they could target engineers or what have you, right? So, but we never ruled out the possibility of charging a fee, and I think that'd be on a project by project basis. So contact Coinbase or whatever.
Okay, cool. Anyway, I interrupted you. Go on. So you
mentioned. So lessons learned. I mean, I think the turnaround of 21 was challenging, but I'm proud of where it landed up. I wrote that whole blog post on it, so I won't go back and rehash everything. But the post called The Turnaround. I think what was what did I learn about that? It's interesting to think about what I would have done differently with the information I had at the time. It's challenging because like taking over a hardware business and like trying to figure out something and like pivoting it and so on when there's no clear door. One of the things that made it particularly hard was that the Bitcoin roadmap sort of silently changed in the middle from, Gavin Anderson had written like the billion transaction roadmap, if you remember this, in late 2014, right? You remember that?
Yes.
Yeah. And then that changed, of course, to the whole small block roadmap. I'm not litigating that, but the point being that like mid pivot to realize that your pivot is kind of blown up by other factors because micropayments became increasingly impossible on chain. Fine, whatever, like that's now in the rearview mirror, but they did. That was something which, I mean, I had known this before. And sometimes you just have bad luck and sometimes you have good luck. But, there's this concept of, and again, not new to me, but just something I might have stressed even more, of like really trying to minimize every possible risk and just do the minimum number of risks at the same time. That's one concept. I mean, the second thing that's interesting about it is, like, I actually think a lot of the ideas that we put out at 21, prior to focusing on one of them, which turned into Earn, which became very successful, like paid API keys and, machine payable URLs and so on and so forth. I think a lot of that stuff is going to come about. Mm-hmm. A lot of those tutorials and stuff we had all work if you swap in basically another coin that is more suitable for like small payments or more programmable payments and so on. And it turned out that paid email, we did a whole spreadsheet on it, so it's systematic. But paid email was the one that was that had the least bandwidth requirements, and where we could do a lot of batching, where people would do a bunch of paid emails, in a centralized way, and then once in a while they would cash out. And the cash out was an on-chain transaction, and you might answer 20 paid emails and only cash out once. So we reduced the on-chain volume, which was like the number one engineering constraint, right? I think a lot of other things will work. What I probably want to do is like republish them with like open source edits of them to make them work with, either Ethereum or one of the other coins that's out there right now. I just have to kind of set up the dev environment to do it. So I haven't sat down and tried out every coin, but maybe like Solana or something like that might be better for lots of fast payments. So that's maybe what I would have done. I'm not sure if that's would have done differently, but that's something I've thought about. It's just seeing if you could mitigate risk even more.
All right. So we're over time. So I'll just we'll close it out. Just anything that we haven't talked about that you think is important for the audience to know that we should talk about.
I think crypto is what comes after Silicon Valley. I think crypto is sort of in the range that, Web 2.0 and so on was in the early 2000s, where there's a core group of true believers, and the desktop people have sort of written it off. I mean, the thing that's interesting is I talked to a very senior Microsoft executive a while back, and he said something offhand that I thought was fascinating. He said, no one was making money on the internet except Google until basically after 2008. I was like, what a I mean, that's true from when you're talking Microsoft scale money, right? And that's actually why Ballmer was able to ignore the internet for so long, because he thought it was just Google or Google plus Apple, and Apple was really doing hardware, so it wasn't really an internet company, And Amazon was fine, but Amazon is a little bit of a late bloomer, where it kind of only became the Goliath that it is over the last 10 years. Obviously it was big before that. AWS is big, but the first AWS exit was Instagram in 2012, right? The cloud is not that old, and in fact, AWS was the kind of business that everybody got warned not to do because it was so capital intensive. It had been the graveyard of empires. Like Ben Horowitz barely survived with Loud Cloud, and for Amazon to do that several years later was an enormous risk for them in the mid 2000s, and so we sort of forget how relatively recent that time period was, where angel investing wasn't something that everybody was doing, where VC was still something where, it was all 30-somethings investing in 30-something. Well, it was like 50-somethings investing in 30-somethings, 20 million in 30-somethings, right? And the entire YC, Web 2.0, SaaS, put everything online, believe in the internet is still real, it's not a hype, it's not a fad, it's here to stay. That whole thing of basically, it's not the only thing, but the initial sort of YC thing was just take every desktop app and put it online, right? And so of course Google did that with Docs and PowerPoint and Word, but in a real sense, if you look at many of the SaaS apps, they're doing that. They're taking some offline desktop functionality or business process and putting that online, right? It's a major theme. And now what we've got is something similar, where crypto is sort of off to the side of tech. It overlaps with it, but it's still really not taken seriously by lots of people in tech. And what's interesting about it is it's the same kind of potential in some ways also that open source offered, which is to say crypto offers open state and open execution. And if you understand what that is, if you understand that, hey, not just access to the source code, but access to the database and access to reviewing the history of every opcode is actually really important, you're like, wow, okay, if open source was this big, how big are open state and open execution? How big is it to have a database for every user, root user? And so I think that crypto becomes the next Silicon Valley for those reasons. And then a couple more, which is crypto is remote first by default. Crypto is international by default. Crypto is post-American by default, right? Crypto is encrypted. It is, that's why I had this article earlier this year, Bitcoin becomes a flag of technology, where a lot of the implicit values of Bitcoin or the implicit values of tech become explicit in Bitcoin. And just to quote from that article for a second, basically there's 10 values, which are, it's internationalist. Bitcoin is internationalist, and so is tech. It's capitalist, it's decentralized, it's hyper-deflationary, it's networked, it's encrypted, it's digital, it's volatile, it's ambitious, and it's quietly revolutionary, meaning you're not standing out in a street corner. Revolution comes from a million individual voluntary actions in the privacy of one's home or one's phone, right? And yet the change still happens, right? And I mentioned, why is tech decentralized? Well, there's no king of tech, right? It's funny, Ben Evans has this good one-liner, which is man, it's amazing that it's not just amazing that tech has monopolies, it's amazing how many of them there are. Ha ha ha, right? Meaning, oh, wow, you got so many monopolies. Well, okay, maybe they're not actually monopolies. And you can, of course, argue that for any given vertical, whatever, right? But it is decentralized, where there's no one person who speaks for all of tech. It's and there's a bunch of different VCs, angels, lots of different theses. There's a community, but it is it diverges in many ways. And what crypto is sort of the muscular version of that. It's a version that puts those values into code. And has done so, fortunately, in such a way that it's very hard to corrupt. And I think about Thiel's one-liner, it's not really one-liner, his observation 10 years ago, which I didn't really understand at the time, but I think about a lot in terms of how prescient it was. And he said, the race between politics and technology may turn out to be very close. It may come down to the wire. And the fate of humanity may depend on one person who makes the world safe for capitalism. And that's Satoshi, right? And Satoshi, I think, had just shipped Bitcoin 2 months before Thiel wrote that in 2009. And I'm really amazed. That's actually Thiel's most prescient line, because, to see that in 2009, maybe it's because he had seen the financial crisis and, the printing of money and so on that was happening. But also had seen the rise of Facebook. Probably, those are kind of the data points that were in his head at that time. But boy, it really seems to hold today, when you have, on the one hand, all of this surveillance and censorship and, corporate deplatforming and just general polarization, negativity, and whatnot happening. On the other hand, you have supersonic airplanes finally happening, and Mars landers, and you have crypto, and you have GPT-3, and you have even though it was held back by the FDA, you have these fast vaccines. You actually have a lot of good things happening. And so it's this, really neck and neck race, where the collision, I think, one of the big collisions is going to be MMT versus BTC this decade.